Welcome to the Queer Witch Project, your resource for all things queer and witchy. I am Damona Peacock, a fabulous, non-binary, neurospicy, ordained queerdo with a fascination for all things cycles, symbolism, and patterns.
And I'm Moonkittee, your queer femme, poly kitchen witch, and proud geek. Today's topic is queering the runes with Siri Vincent Plouff.
Yay!
Yay!
Okay, I'm going to read a bio for Siri before we say hello. Siri Vincent Plouff, she, is a Nordic witch, rune reader, and tarot reader based on Anishinaabe and Dakota land, aka Minneapolis, Minnesota. As an unabashedly queer person, they are constantly interrogating runes and Nordic practices through a unique lens of gender identity. They share their knowledge of all things heathenry on their podcast, The Heathen's Journey. Siri teaches and writes about the runes, tarot, and witchcraft, and
Welcome.
has a book coming out, or has released a book.
Yes, I have. I'm so happy to be here today.
We're very happy to have you here.
Yes, yes. So, one of the first things we always do for any of our guests is we ask this question because it can mean so many different things. Is what does the phrase queer witch mean to you? Not necessarily if you
Mm.
identify, but when you hear that phrase, what does the phrase queer witch mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, I've been thinking a lot lately about why we call ourselves witches and why witch is the term that
Mhm.
is so ubiquitous for a magic worker now. Specifically because there are a lot of historic terms for people who do magic and they are not all witches.
Mhm.
And so I'm kind of trying to like make witch be a specific term that means a specific thing
Hmm.
in my brain rather than
Mm.
just like magic worker is a witch. And for me, the difference really is like, especially coming from a European, historic, like traditional kind of magical perspective. We have the cunning folk and folk magicians
Mhm.
who were like town healers, literally town apothecaries, like all of those things who would often actually be, working against witches in a lot of ways. And then you would have the ceremonial magicians who are, kind of like the wealthy white men, let's be real, in their ivory towers doing their ivory tower things, with their very expensive little toys. Um, it's fine, whatever. I just like to tease them. Um,
I like that too. I like it. I'm here for it. I'm living for
Mhm.
this. I live.
yeah. And then I see the witch kind of as like the one on the edge of the forest who's like a little scary, but who's like willing to fuck someone up for you. Like this is the person who like you go to when, you need something bad to happen to your enemy's cow, for example, or like something devilish to occur. And so for me, witch itself, like the term, has really sort of coalesced into this idea of rebellion and living on the margins and living kind of like outside of society in a lot of ways. In many ways, that queer people are either forced to live outside of society or, choose to. Many of us live on the margins. Many of us are, not necessarily like approved of by our greater communities, but we are still useful to our greater communities. And so they keep us around sometimes. Um, and so when I think of the term queer witch, like it really feels very real to me that those things would intertwine in that specific kind of way.
Mhm.
Um, and I also will say I recently interviewed so I recently interviewed Kellyanne Maddox actually for my
Wow.
newest podcast, which hasn't been released yet, called Chaos and Cunning. Um, and it's all about the intersection of folk magic and chaos magic and like how do we
Oh,
be like effective practitioners and all of this
Mhm.
stuff. So
very
I'm really
cool.
excited about that. Um,
Noted.
Mhm.
Yes. But we talked a lot about, kind of activism because she's been very outspoken about a free Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
and everything. And so we were talking about all of that stuff. And I asked her about, like, do you think that because her first book is called Rebel Witch, and so I was like, do you think that rebel witch, like the like witch itself is like a rebellious term? And she said, well, there are a lot of people who call themselves witches now who are not very rebellious. or who are even
Ooh.
upholding bad
Mm.
like patterns. And I do see that as well. So I think that like queer witch kind of like puts a very specific spin on it.
Mhm.
Very noted, yes. I never understood the one true wayism in the pagan community of like, aren't we already forging our own spiritual path in the face of the overculture anyway? So you're going to come in and tell me that what works for me is wrong because it's not the rule that you follow? Well, all right, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So we wanted to have you here so we could talk about the runes. Before we dive into like queering the runes, could you just tell us a little bit about runes? Like what does someone new to the subject need to know about them, and are they available knowledge or resource for everyone to access?
Yes, absolutely. So the runes are essentially they're letters, actual letters, that were used in Germanic speaking, primarily Scandinavian countries, for a very long time. And they do have spiritual and historic kind of meanings
Mhm.
that we can trace back into Nordic literature. Um, and they also can just straight up be used as like an alphabet. Like you can write in the runes. They're, a
Mhm.
phonetic alphabet. So they don't have like a, Fehu means F. Like they don't necessarily have that, but they do have that phonetic they do associate with certain sounds.
Hmm.
And so there are three primary runic alphabets. We have the Elder Futhark, the Younger Futhark, and the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. Um, and then eventually in the Middle Ages, Old Norse speakers, the Norse speakers, transitioned from using runes to using the Latin alphabet. So we actually lost their meaning for a really long period of time, and they were decoded in the Elder Futhark, I should say, which is the set that I primarily use. It is a set of 24 symbols, and it was decoded phonetically in 1862 or 1864.
Okay.
You're, yeah. So
Everything old that is new again, and everything new is old again. This is
exactly.
so I know why you had the brain fart when we started because you can't just answer. That's such a big question. The
Yeah.
runes is this whole thing. And I don't know, do you want the history of it? Do you want the how it's used now? Do you want but I like how you broke that down. Yeah, how you're breaking it down. Okay, so
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to use them too, which I think is part of like a huge part of why I'm fascinated with them and why I use them so often. Um, like you can use them for divination. There are meanings that are put onto them for divination purposes by our, you know, modern occult scholars.
Mhm.
The way that we get the meanings for the runes actually comes from these things called rune poems, primarily. And
Hmm.
so these were sort of like the old poems that are like A is for apple, B is for ball, except they were kind of like little tiny like snippets of wisdom. So, or like a kenning or a riddle or something like that. So that's how we get the basis for like the beginning understanding of what they are. And then, scholars have continued to expound on that, and broaden those horizons. So they're absolutely fascinating. We also have in
yeah.
the medieval Old Norse
Mhm.
literature, there are many instances in the Poetic Edda where Odin will refer to, do you know how to carve them? Do you know how to write them? Do you know how to say them? Do you know how to do these? And then he'll say, like, I know how to cast love spells. I know how to cast, spells to
Wow.
like find your, to like shock your enemy, like all of these different things. But he never actually says what runes are associated with what,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is so incredibly Nordic. Like, it's not even funny.
I'm just like
Um,
that's so incredibly like leaning into the mystery of it all.
Mhm.
Like this is
I
what we think, but we don't know.
yes.
I know this. I'm not going to tell
Exactly.
you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it also is
And
making me think of Thoth, like how it's like this is the power of language. You can't cast a spell
yes.
if you don't have some level of having mastery over expression.
Yes, exactly. And it's like you had mentioned that you were obsessed with signs and symbols and all of those things. So I don't know if you went down this rabbit hole ever, but in the book I actually talk about the runes as being powerful magically, specifically because they are symbols that are not illustrative.
Mm.
Mm,
Um, so they're symbols that we can agree
right.
mean these cluster of things, but they're also not like, say the death card or like the lover's
Right.
card or something like that. Because I do love and read tarot myself as well, but it's
Hmm.
just a very different modality for me. They operate on very different levels. So I talk in the book a lot about like um the runes operating on a symbolic level because they are the sign and the signified all at once.
And
Um,
I also think, in a way, because there's this universal collective consciousness agreed upon that these meanings that gives them that power. So
yes.
it's like a cycle.
Yes, yeah, they're a cycle and they're oh, this is a symbol that means this, but it could also mean these other things because you have learned your own secrets of the runes. I love them for that. I think that they're very complex. And
Yes.
they can also very easily be used magically. So like, do you know how to carve them? Do you know how to use them? Odin is talking not just about writing and the written language, but also about like carving them into armor, let's say, or carving them into, in my case, I most often carve them into candles, or,
Mhm.
you
Mm,
can use them very easily magically. The other thing I do is I often will like trace them on my body with like an
yeah.
anointing oil that I've enchanted,
Mm.
so like there's a lot of
I
different ways that you can use them that
I was
it's
going to say
dependent.
I've seen people design tattoos
Yes.
to incorporate
Yes.
designs to incorporate them for whatever they're embodying.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think that because they're very simple figures that are very easy for, pretty much anyone can draw these.
Mhm.
Like if
Hmm.
you are capable of writing like the Latin alphabet, you are more than capable of writing, in any of the Futharks. So yeah, they operate very interestingly. And to answer the second part of your question
Mhm.
is, are they available to anyone? This is what I like to say. If
Yay.
people say that they are not available, they are probably Nazis.
Oh, good. Good to
Yeah.
know.
Good.
Yeah.
I appreciate having that bar that because I also been exposed to but never engaging in Nordic
Mhm.
practices mostly because when I was a young pagan people were side-eyeing that for because it can be now not every Nordic tradition is a white supremacist tradition, but unfortunately they have bad actors within that umbrella, and we have to be able to discern um, who's actually, sharing spiritual wisdom and who's being using it to manipulate ideas.
Yes. So I have, I think it's either the second or the third chapter of the book is just like I call it a radical heathen's history of the runes. So I
Nice.
talk about how that like they have been co-opted by, white supremacists. And I talk about that history. So whenever people ask me if they're, open and available to everybody, I say, well, if somebody tells you they're not open and available, that person is probably literally like a neo-Nazi, or a white supremacist. So yes, they
Okay.
are. But I will also add the caveat that they are culturally specific at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So they definitely have their roots in, Germanic peoples, Germanic tribes, Scandinavian peoples. But culture itself is not a closed practice. Culture is something that can be learned and very much was learned.
Mm.
Um, because I think people often think of our ancestry, especially in the United States, where so much of us is like, I'm talking about white people here, white people like myself.
Mhm.
So often people are like, oh, I want to, like figure out what my ancestry is, but I have so many different nationalities making up my ancestors. So, like kind of like looking back to like Norway or looking back to, Germany or England or something as like this kind of like, oh, it was more stable and structured. And that is not true. People have been migrating,
Yes.
since the dawn of
For
time.
yes. Over and
So,
over and over
hmm
again.
yeah, so like
Migrating, intermarrying, all of
intermarrying,
it.
migrating, sharing culture, like all of that stuff. So, like sharing culture is absolutely possible. And I think
Mm.
that, you know, while they are definitely like symbols that are specific within kind of like a specific cultural lens, they are also symbols that can be learned.
Really love is that you get both when you decide to learn them. You sit down, you're not just learning the runes and their meaning, but you're also learning the mythology and the history of, so it's like it really can be a huge cultural exchange, which I think broadens everybody's, perspectives, horizons.
Yeah, and that's kind of why looking back on the book, because I'm writing a class right now, for querying the runes. I'm writing like an in-depth, like there's a full lecture for every rune, like there is like like full like teaching curricula, like etc. that is going to be released via Teachable.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that's coming. Um, and I'm looking back at the book and I'm like, wow, I kept so much cultural information in there. I talk about, how my ancestors viewed horses, for example, and that's not necessarily like a queer thing.
Hmm
So, but I wanted to maintain some of that cultural specificity so that people who are not like familiar with Nordic culture would be getting some of that, because I figured that with a title like Queering the Runes, like a lot of people who aren't necessarily like explicitly heathens might feel
hmm
comfortable coming to it. So I like wanted to preserve some of that, yes. Um and so
I'm the person, I'm the demographic you wrote for. I might just read your book.
yes,
And I don't have
yes,
a lot of rune knowledge at all, other than, just
yeah.
people that I know runes, but not me.
hmm
Yeah, and so I wanted to maintain some of that cultural specificity, but there is such a thing as word count limits. And um and so I had to kind of pare it down. And while I was writing it, was on this massive journey of learning kind of the cultural background and like folk ways and folk traditions of my Nordic ancestors. And so a lot of that crept into the book in, ways that now I'm like, I could have made this more gay. Like I could have made this more gay, which is what I'm doing in the class. Like it's queering the runes, but more this
But
time.
more gay.
This
Oh,
time
Yeah.
with
that's so
extra
good.
gay.
Yeah.
I'm like, we've never had moments where we're like, oh, I should have talked about this or I should have talked about that.
Never happens to
Right.
me.
Yeah. So it was kind of this weird, like, I need to walk this like tightrope of like talking about, the folk culture,
hmm
and all of this stuff so that people understand that like cultural context, because I feel like I do have a very specific cultural context for working in Norse ways. Like, I live in Minneapolis. Minnesota and Wisconsin have like some of the largest numbers of Scandinavian immigrants
Mm.
like
Hmm.
in the country. Um, and we don't just have like a Scandinavian cultural center. We have a American Swedish Institute. We have Norway House. We have the Danish Center. And then we
Wow.
also have all of these groups that are doing, like, oh, we do Nordic folk dance. We have like a Nordic ball that happens in Minneapolis
Wow.
Wow.
every year. Like so I actually was just there on Thursday. We have a store called Ingebrigtsen's in Minneapolis that has just celebrated its 100th anniversary of being in business. And it
Wow.
was founded by like Ingebrigtsen, like a Scandinavian
hmm
immigrant.
Very cool.
Yeah, so like
Yeah.
I have a
History.
very rooted cultural context in
Mm-hmm.
which to talk about runes, and so I brought a lot of that into the book in some ways. And then um could have definitely made the book more gay, but I also wanted to leave some of this juicy stuff in there in like honor of the ancestors.
Tease. We tease for the next.
Yes.
So how did you personally get started working with, again, I'm assuming because your culture and growing up and in these communities, these vibrant, amazing communities, what drew you initially as a child or even as a teenager to that kind of aspect of it?
It's so funny. So the first line of the book is I was dragged kicking and screaming into working with Odin.
Okay.
Um, yeah. um because so I grew up and it was so normal for me. Like I
Hmm.
was just like, well, that's not interesting. Like everybody's like eating lefse. So I was like, well, that's really boring. I don't want to deal with that. So I long story short, I was initially initiated Wiccan as a teen because I sought it out and my parents are very open and
Hmm.
understanding. And so they were just like, oh yeah, so Siri found, this coven and I don't know what they're doing, but like fine, that's cool. And when I moved away to college, I moved away from Wicca in certain ways. I think that the theology of Wicca just
Hmm.
didn't necessarily work for me on a certain level. And people love to engage in Wicca bashing. That is definitely not what I'm here to do.
Hmm.
It just wasn't for me. It's
Hmm.
kind of like Christianity also isn't for me.
Hmm.
And no disrespect. So I was looking for something different and I was kind of like working on like self-initiations into more modern witchcraft or more
Hmm.
like non-Wiccan witchcraft. And I was reading Starhawk and I
Hmm.
was like, what's all this shit about goddesses? Um, and so I did a ritual that was like, okay, I'm gonna call in and I'm gonna call my like, the goddess that wants to work with me, et cetera, into the circle with me. And Odin showed up.
I was gonna be like, you got Odin.
Yeah, I got Odin. And I was like, I was so funny about it at the time too, because like you would think that I would not have had quite this reaction because I was literally doing a ritual to try to meet a goddess, but I was like, well, deities don't really exist anyway. So this is just like a spirit that's calling himself Odin and like whatever.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So like, yeah. Um
And he's like, yes, my child.
yeah, right. Yeah, he was just like, okay, whatever.
Whatever you need to believe
So
right
then
now, fine.
yeah, whatever is gonna get you there,
Mm-hmm.
really.
Mm-hmm.
So I, over the next several months, I had like some crazy synchronicities that like, oh, this is actually probably Odin. Like there was a murder of crows that started following me around, for example, and kind of like moved in really close to my apartment. And I'm talking like there's something in Minneapolis that we call the Minneapolis murder of crows.
Okay.
This is like hundreds of birds. This is not
Huh.
like 10 crows. It's like,
We're talking Alfred Hitchcock levels of birds.
yes, we are talking Alfred Hitchcock levels of the birds that I just kept running into. I kept running into the Minneapolis murder. Um,
It's such a
I mean,
great
that sounds
name.
like a story.
I know.
and so like that was happening, and then I would be like talking to like, somebody, and they would just like randomly bring up Nordic mythology. Just, somebody who wouldn't normally be talking about that was now talking about it. I visited my grandmother and she said something really interesting and weird about like her family growing up. And I was like, oh, what's that about? Or I listened in a different way than I had for a really
Yeah.
long time. And so it just kind of all coalesced into, okay, I guess I'm working with Odin now, but I was still really resistant to doing it because I had met Norse pagans who were not great in the past.
Mhm.
And I was just like, okay, well, I don't really want to deal with this. But the mythology is super fascinating and like the poetry is actually really beautiful. So I'm gonna figure something out here. And eventually, my career in public policy, actually, I was in grad school and got the opportunity to spend a summer in Norway.
Mm.
Wow.
And it was just so incredible. Like, I have never felt more at home
Hmm.
in my body, like in a place anywhere. I felt so completely supported by the land spirits in Norway. It's like not even funny. And so I was like, okay, I need to know the runes. I need to learn the runes because it felt
Mhm.
like learning their language in a way. And my journey with runes has always been fairly public as well. I actually ended up pitching because that was also right at the beginning of my what I at the time in very 2016 lingo was referring to as my side hustle, um, reading tarot cards for people and doing that as a business. And so I followed this blog called Little Red Tarot, based out of the UK. It's this queer tarot blog. And I pitched Beth, the primary owner of the blog. I pitched her as an article series on runes where I would just like write my way through the runes, like as a beginner, like what am I
Mhm.
noticing? And that eventually became the book, Queering the
Mm.
Runes.
Mhm.
Very cool. Oh.
Yeah.
So it's
So when
like,
Beth stopped publishing what's called the community page of her blog, I just pivoted into doing it on a podcast, which became the Heathen's Journey podcast. And then I realized that I had way more that I wanted to say about the runes. I had always wanted to write a book. I'd always wanted to be an author. So I just expanded into a book, and that book became Queering the Runes. So I've been working on this project in one way or another for about 7 years now.
Wow.
wow. So that was going to be our next question is what inspired the book itself? Was there any like lightning strike moment where you're like, now I have to make a book?
It was always kind of a part of it. I mean, I think that so I learned very much by writing.
Mm,
Mhm.
Um, and so in the early days when I was like putting out the Heathen's Journey, which it was named that because I pitched it originally to a tarot blog,
Mhm.
and Fool's Journey, Heathen's Journey, like it made, it
clever.
made sense.
I like
Um,
it.
and
Thanks
then
for
it also
explaining that one.
yeah.
I'm gonna have to go look you up. I'm gonna look that one up because I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I because
Mhm.
I would what my brain thought when you said Heathen's Journey is that as if you were making a reality show on somebody who is just taking a deep dive starting out, like not afraid to start out and show this is how you get started.
If I hadn't been so terrified of YouTube, I think
Mm.
that might have been it.
Mhm.
Like, like I'm vlogging my like journey
Mm-hmm.
into
Mm-hmm.
heathenry. But no, yeah, so I always have kind of like learned by writing and pulling my thoughts together on the page and, that kind of thing. And I was trying to pivot into more of a writing career. So it made sense to pitch an editor that I had a friendly relationship with for this series.
Nice.
And I also fell in love with podcasts around the same time. So when that blog, when she stopped the community version of that
Mhm.
blog, which it was a paid writing opportunity, right? So, like
Nice.
that was like a specific thing, So like she in
Mm-hmm.
her business, it just like didn't make sense anymore. So then I got into podcasting and everything just kind of rolled from there. But I've always wanted to be a writer. Like that's been my main like dream
Mm-hmm.
since I was
Mhm.
a very small child. So the book was
You are.
always an idea.
Mhm.
Yes, I
Yes.
guess
And
I
you are a
am.
writer. Yeah.
I guess.
Uh, not now. You've always been. It
Mm,
just again, it's every step of the way, right? You build into it. But yeah,
yeah.
you're a writer. You are a writer.
Mhm.
It's so exciting.
Yes. So now my baby is out in the world,
Mhm.
has its like month birthday coming up.
Yay!
Yay!
So yeah. Yeah, I feel very proud.
Yeah, I'm over here like, okay, where do I start? Do I start with your podcast? Well, I'm an audio learner, so I'll probably end up starting with your podcast, but I also want to read your book.
Yeah, yeah. So the podcast is fantastic and I have a lot of really good guests. So the way that I don't know if this is going to be boring for your listeners, but like the way I'm kind of moving with
Mhm.
my public kind of content stuff, is that I'm moving more into chaos and cunning so that I can talk about other aspects of my practice,
Mhm.
without
Mm,
being limited to heathenry, because
Mhm.
Heathen's Journey, it's just like so like on the nose that like I feel like I kind of, you know,
hmm
Can I
having
talk about chaos magic in the Heathen's Journey podcast? Absolutely, but it's not necessarily the best audience for it.
Mhm.
But whenever I have something that is heathen related, I will continue to update the Heathen's Journey podcast. It'll just be
Okay.
like a cross post. Because I'm very much still a heathen, but I
Mhm.
also have had like a lot of twists and turns in my own magical practice. Like I've been diving into my strong French Canadian ancestry on the other side of my family. I've been my Polish ancestors are kind of like, okay, like it's time now. Like we need to talk
Mhm.
folk magic. And I have other just like very interesting things that don't fall into like an ancestral. Well, I mean, everything falls into an ancestral veneration practice for me, but like that aren't directly related to an ancestral culture that I do.
Mhm.
So I wanted that space.
That's awesome.
I like,
Was there
yeah.
any major, as you're writing the book, and I know you mentioned you want to make it more gay with the with what you're talking about the classes and everything going on to it. Was there any other big like lesson that you learned after writing it, going, okay, now I've done this part. I know what not to do next time, or taking the lessons. But I guess if you started with a podcast and let it kind of transition in, was that also helpful?
I think it was helpful. So I have been doing this thing for a while where I was like doing an episode on each rune in between interview episodes. I really
Hmm.
like I as you can kind of tell, I like the podcasting format of like having some
Hmm.
solo episodes and having some interview episodes.
Yes, yes.
Just because I think it kind of keeps it fresh for the
Hmm.
listeners and also like I'm a professional in this field. I have
Right.
things to say that are just me, you know?
Yep.
Um, but I also my relationship with the runes is constantly changing and evolving. One thing that has changed a lot for me over the course of writing this book is who my primary sources are has
Mm,
changed a lot. And that might be, oh, I found out that this person is a horrifying TERF.
Mm.
Okay,
right.
I'm gonna disregard that. Or, there were like I knew which like white supremacists to stay away from, like
Hmm.
when I kind of started, because I do tend to do a bit of a dive into authors before I read them. Meanwhile, a lot of other people have been publishing. There are more inclusive books that are coming out on runes or heathenry in general. I think the biggest thing for me that was the biggest shift was that when I started with the column, right, I was thinking about
Hmm.
it as, okay, this is divination. This is for divination. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to change my magical practice.
Hmm.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, my magical practice is still like the chaotic, like modern traditional like thing that it is, but I did change a lot. Like I actually did study with I did distance study with a Swedish, like a professional Swedish folk magician. Like he lives in Sweden and is a
Hmm.
current folk magician. Like I have, a mentor here in Minneapolis who has been doing like this deep rune and heathen and Nordic root culture work for decades.
Hmm.
So like my
Hmm.
understanding of things has expanded so much.
Hmm.
And that's kind of why I didn't want to leave it with just the book. I wanted to also come out with the course Queering the Runes because there's just so much that I can't fit into a book.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
actually, yeah, so there's the one of the last chapters is a chapter on rune magic because the individual chapters on each of the runes have, like cultural knowledge, divination meanings. I talk about the rune poetry, I talk about some Nordic history. I also talk about some like anarchist or like lefty beliefs
Hmm.
regarding each of these runes and what they can mean. Then I have journal entry or journal prompts for each rune and everything. And then I have a section on a chapter after that on like, how do you actually read runes? Like, how does the divination aspect of this work? And then I wanted to include a rune magic chapter because that's a really important part of working with runes for me, especially,
Hmm.
and for a lot of people, they're so unique in that they lend themselves so well to magical practice. I was writing it and I was like, oh, this is a different book.
Hmm.
Like this, I could keep going. This could be too
Hmm.
long.
Mhm.
And my editor was just like, Siri, you can have more than one book.
Yep, that's what I was
Right.
thinking. I'm like, well, there's always a sequel that can come out.
Yes.
I
Right.
mean, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna buy your book for my girlfriend for
Aw.
Yule. And
Mhm.
how do we get a hold of your book?
Yes.
So, yeah, so my book is published through Wiser, which is a traditional publisher. So you can actually buy it anywhere. I do also have a pagan online shop, though. So you can buy it directly
Ooh.
from me, and I
Yes.
will
That's the best
autograph it.
practice. That's I like to do with some of my other favorite creators. So we will make sure that a link to that gets put in our show notes.
Yeah, yeah. So the bookshop is called Lore Books and Supplies. Lore as in like folklore.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's lore-books.com. And you can just, you can buy the book. You can also buy my first book, which is about tarot. I co-authored with Cassandra Snow, who wrote Querying the Tarot and Querying Your
Nice.
Craft. Yes, the querying your tarot, querying your craft, querying the runes. We kind of like kept it in the chosen family
Yes.
there.
Nice. Love it.
Um, yes, but and if you or anybody listening wants it inscribed or, made out to somebody for a gift or something like that, just like shoot me a little email and I can address it to the correct person.
Okay.
Very
So
cool.
we'll put your email in the thing as well, so you can see
Yes.
that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Is there any parting wisdom that you want to share with our listeners and or anyone really who might be coming in or curious about this topic of runes and how to make them more queer and how to access their queer part of themselves while doing this?
Yeah, so with the runes specifically, I also have a very animistic practice in a lot of ways. So one of the things I like to say is go to the source.
Mm-hmm.
Like say you're looking at the rune Ehwaz, and you're just like, I don't understand what's going on with this rune. Well, ask it. Like just sit there and ask it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there
What
are
are
specific
you?
ways. What are you? What are you doing? And like learning how to listen, I think is really, really important. And it's for any divination method,
Hmm.
any kind of, witchcraft method, like learning how to listen is really important. And it
Hmm.
can be really difficult, but allowing that, meditating with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes I think too that like you have very like predictive models of divination and then very like reflective or philosophical models of divination.
Hmm.
So what works for you is what's best, right? I personally find the runes to be very reflective. They often do not necessarily tell me what I asked. They tell me
Hmm.
what I need to know. So if I want to hear about my love life and how juicy that could be, but I'm a fucking dumpster fire at my job, like they're gonna tell me how I'm a fucking dumpster fire at my job. There's a little bit less control with the outcome. So that is my experience. As some people say that the runes are very blunt. I think that it depends on your reading style. I do think that they are very blunt, but at the same time, extremely poetic,
Hmm.
which I think makes sense given that
Hmm.
it is a culture that relied very heavily on poetry and meter and kennings. There are literally over 500 names for Odin that we know of.
Wow.
So like they're gonna be very evocative and poetic. And other parting stuff about like finding queerness within yourself, I think that like giving yourself permission to disagree with your sources
Hmm.
is really important. And that is something that I, practice regularly, whether it's, for just um, my own sources, my own writing, like all of that. Or if I'm writing, I might disagree with a popular name in the field, and that's totally okay. And that's part of what queering things is. Like everything is queer.
Hmm.
Everything can be queer. And, allowing these tools to support you in your queerness is a radical act
Mm-hmm.
and one that I think we need more and more of.
When you
Um,
said disagree with your sources, I thought about how many queer people were taught to be heteronormative
yes.
by their parents and the parents' dream for grandkids or whatever it is. And you can disagree with those sources too. You can just be you.
Yeah, just
They
be
don't
you,
get to
just
they don't get to choose who you are. They birthed you, but that doesn't mean that they know you.
yes, exactly, exactly. Like forging your own path is hard, but the runes are a tough as nails ally in
Nice.
that.
I like that.
So, yeah.
Well, you've definitely inspired me to get more into it. I mean, aside from my girlfriend constantly kicking and screaming into like, let me pull runes for you. Damn, that's really good. I should look into this more often.
Yeah, they're kind of intimidating, I think. What,
Yes.
yeah, what is your primary divination tool, or do you have one?
Tarot. Tarot and
Tarot, okay.
Oracle. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So coming from that, I think like coming from a system that is so visually and artistically
Yeah.
rich to something that is such a simple little symbol can be really difficult. Oh, the other thing I would say, okay, this is rune specific learning. Um you can get a rune deck, but you will be missing out on some really cool ways of working with them if you don't get
Mm.
like the actual like rune stones or wooden runes or bone runes or something. Like,
Okay.
Because they
um,
take on the essence of what they're carved into, maybe a little bit.
I mean, that could be a part of it. It's mostly so I like to cast runes on a cloth.
Oh,
And then the way that they relate to one another, the way that they fall on the cloth, how they're facing, um, it's just tact in a
right.
tactile way, very different from working with cards. Um, and
Interesting.
yeah, and so I think that, you kind of do yourself a disservice if you only use rune
Cards.
cards.
Mm.
Um, but also cards are cool and I like shuffling and
Mhm.
I get it, like I'm also a tarot and
Right.
oracle reader, like I understand.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Right. That's
Um,
why I'm like, oh, this is a bridge I've not crossed, but that bridge is it's a short bridge.
it is,
I
yeah, a
can
short
easily
bridge.
cross it.
Yeah. And then also the other thing with rune study is don't forget that they are letters and could literally be spelling it out for you.
Okay.
Like,
Interesting.
yeah, I have had runes like spell out names when I've cast them on a cloth, and then the client is like,
Wow.
"Oh, I know exactly who that is. Like, I know exactly what that's about." And I was like, "Okay, well, reading done, I guess." Like,
There's your answer
there
right
you go.
there. That's really cool.
Yeah,
Wow.
so don't discredit like the linguistic application of runes because it's an
You said
important
you
one.
you call them blunt. You tell me that they'll spell things out for you. It's like they're made for the Tism brain.
Yeah.
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 I really appreciate how, yeah, I just really appreciate how you've deepened our own knowledge of,
Yes, very
what
much.
the runes can be, and you made it so accessible for us as a queer witch.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. That's like what I want my work to do, right? Is that I want people to feel like, oh, this is both deep and also not intimidating now.
Mhm.
I think there's
I
very unfortunately a thing in occult writing. Thank you, Aleister Crowley.
See, that's
Um,
one of those ones where I'm like, yes, we can read that one for filth if you want to.
yes, please. Like, oh my God, yeah. So thank you, Aleister Crowley, for making it such a trend for so long for occult authors to purposefully obscure their meanings, which is
Yeah.
definitely something he did a lot
Mhm.
in his writing. And, reading it, I'm kind of like, okay, this is kind of word salad, but like, I'm not a ceremonial magician. I'm not interested in Crowley. I think he's a fascinating historical
Mhm.
figure. And like, I think that, like that's not to like say anything about people who are, interested in Crowley or whatever, but just like for me personally, like if I'm teaching, if I'm writing, I want people to actually understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and
Fair.
yeah, and there is something to be said for a mystery tradition for sure, but I feel like the mystery tradition is where you're asking the runes directly.
Yep.
for the wisdom, or you're asking the spirits directly for the wisdom. Like, I am not the gatekeeper.
Yeah. Yeah, all we can do is download as much wisdom that gets us to the precipice of the mystery, but we still have to go in and ask, what are what are you trying to tell me? And like you said, learning to listen. You can't just hand people their inner wisdom. That's not for me to give to someone, but I can try to describe it as best I can to get them to get themselves there. But we have to be able to learn how to strengthen our intuition, listen to our inner knowing, and connect with these symbols and these messengers and these spirits who can communicate with us if we know how to pay attention.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I love the being, divination in general. So yeah, it helps. It helps get through this thing called life.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just fun. I don't know. I feel like
It is.
sometimes people are like
Too serious?
so serious. And I'm like, but isn't it more fun if magic is real and we believe in it?
Yes, I
Like,
agree.
let's do
Yeah, I agree. Follow the magic. Well, we're so grateful for you coming on and enlightening us and chatting about this rune stuff and this queer rune book that you've got out. And we're going to have a lot of links for our listeners so we can find you and find your website and your book and your podcast. And maybe by the time this comes out, your podcasts, like
I'm
plural.
really hoping. I'm really hoping. It's the ever-present battle of like, how much time do I have to spend working at a day job versus how much time can I spend creating and getting paid for
Felt.
that?
Right. I know
Yeah.
that
Yep.
feeling.
Yep. I
Balance. Who
understand.
is she?
So with that, I just want to say that to our listeners, thank you for listening to the Queer Witch Project. And if you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe, give us some thumbs up, some stars, leave us a comment. We love hearing from you.
Yeah.
And if there is a topic you want to know more about or an episode topic you'd like to suggest, contact us at thequeerwitchproject@gmail.com or find us on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram with the handle @queerwitchproject. We upload every other week. And remember, queerness is a key to magic.
Be yourself and love rebelliously. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.